This week, Brussels became the latest European capital to be attacked by ISIS. 2 bombs exploded at the airport and 1 bomb exploded on the metro. 31 people were killed and many more injured. In the wake of a terrorist attack, everything barely worth saying will be said endlessly. And the only things that are worth saying won't be said Douglas Murray, writing for The Spectator yesterday. I'm joined now by Douglas and Haras Rafiq, Managing Director for the Quilliam Foundation, to discuss what kind of response we can expect to see in the wake of these latest attacks. So Douglas Murray, you've described in a blog for the Spectator website this week the predictable response to terror events. What is that?
It goes in several stages. During the first one, lots of people are murdered in cold blood for being on a train or standing at an airport terminal. There's a brief moment of surprise before you go to the second stage, which is people trying to work out a lachrymose response to it that's totally meaningless. For instance, expressing solidarity or praying for the place or calling for other people to pray for the place. All perfectly good things to do in themselves, but now a demonstration of that awful thing, virtue signalling. Governments then come out and condemn it, usually without identifying why it happened. Then you move through a whole set of other phases of denial and avoiding the point. And we're already pretty much in that one. So now producers are phoning people like me and Haras up asking if we could have discussions on liberty versus security, or the Apple FBI discussion, or where do you fall down? I predict we'll get on to the TPIMs versus control orders ones quite soon, when a Labour member of Parliament decides to look tough on this issue by saying how much better it was when we had control orders rather than TPIMs, all of which magnificently manages to continue to avoid any serious discussion. And that's what we're in, and we're deliberately in that, and we will be for a long time to come.
So this isn't sort of the natural stages of grieving. This is actually, you think, an unhelpful way of responding to terrorists.
It's what everyone does now. All sorts of excuses we give, we've all heard them for years. People today are saying it's to do with disenfranchisement maybe in Belgium because the houses these guys lived in weren't as nice as the ones they could live in. Actually, if you look at the Molenbeek houses, most of them are a lot nicer than any house that a well-paid middle-class couple in London can afford to live in. But apparently, if you had such a terrible terrorist Belgian house, you couldn't help but blow yourself up with a suicide vest and take a load of people with you. It's things like that. We just come up with excuses which the terrorists never ask for. They say why they do it, but nobody listens to them. It must be very irritating for them.
And Haras, is that true that actually it is nothing to do with dissatisfaction with life circumstances or deprivation or anything like that? These are all just trite points that are being made by broadcasters, or is there an element of truth in there?
Look, at the end of the day, there are elements of grievances. There are elements that people do have, but then there are a number of us sitting here, 3 of us sitting here today. By the time when we go home tonight in our own beds and we lie down, we will all have grievances that we will think of, and my grievance will be much greater than yours and Douglas's. And why aren't I a jihadist? Why aren't I going killing people? I think that there are too many people that focus on this area, and Douglas is right. I mean, one of the things I'm really, really fed up with, and I've been doing this work now for about 11 years, is having to have the same conversations again and again and again to say, well, is it disenfranchisement? Is it some lack of integration? Is it somebody who can't get a job? Is it somebody who's not educated?
Is it Belgian foreign policy?
Is it Belgian foreign policy? Well, you know, on the foreign policy thing, I will concede to anybody that it's foreign policy. If they can explain to me why Belgian or British foreign policy, how that can inspire British or Belgian Muslims to travel thousands of miles and kill other Muslims and take Yazidi sex slaves. It just doesn't make sense. And it's so annoying and frustrating. It's the ideology. Something is taking some of these people who may have some of these problems, of course everybody has problems, and turns them into jihadists. That's the debate, that's the discussion. And if we don't have that debate, everything else is just useless rhetoric.
And the absence of that debate presumably means that the government finds that there's more pressure to target the things that aren't actually a problem. You say in your piece that when officials are saying that they are doing all they can, you don't seem fully convinced by those lines.
Well, they're not. I was on a primetime BBC political program only a few months ago, when there was a minister who was sat there and he was saying, you know, we need to better understand the root causes of radicalisation and terrorism. And I just turned around to him and said, well, we know what they are. We'd established what they were more than 10 years ago. And I think there's a huge element of politicking. There's a huge element of both social politicking and politicking for votes and everything else that we have these politicians doing. I think there is a denial, and I think there's a symbiotic relationship forming now between, on the one hand, what we call the regressive left, the far left, who live in denial and empower Islamist ideology. Whoops, there I said it, Islamist ideology. They will empower this ideology as being normative Islam, and in some areas, in some parts of the world it is. Then we have the nationalistic, populistic people who will say it's all Muslims and all Islam. Somewhere in the middle is the solution, and I think it's people's inabilities and lack of willingness to actually get into that middle, get into the nuance and tackle these issues head on.
Douglas, what would you expect ministers to be doing in the next few weeks as they respond to what's happened in Brussels, as they prepare for a potential attack on British soil?
Other than praying for the victims.
Yeah, and
hashtags.
And putting together Cobra meetings and grandstanding about the exciting fact that you're doing a Cobra meeting. Look, I mean, everyone's on high alert. Belgium was on high alert at the moment that the bombs went off. France is still in a state of emergency. I mean, months and months after the last attacks there. So this is normal. So the question to my mind is there anything different they're going to do? And the answer to that is no. There's nothing different they're going to do. It's going to go round and round the same thing, which leads to the next question, really, to my mind, which is what would it take to make them do something? The grim truth is, and it's only less or just over 24 hours since people were killed, but the grim truth of it is that 36 people being killed in Brussels is not enough to make the British government do anything. 130 people in Paris is not enough for the British government to do anything. But, you know, consider the following thought experiment. America lost 3,000 people in one day on 9/11. Now, airport security, I think most people agree, if you have to, that among the airport security measures most countries have put in place, that Israel, for instance, has to put in place because of airline hijackings in the past, is some element of profiling. Now, of course, profiling walks against a whole set of things in American civil society that make people very nervous, and without some understandable reasons. So 3,000 people being killed in one day wasn't enough to change American attitudes towards profiling at airports. So how many thousands of people does it take? I think a lot. And unfortunately for all of us, we will be able to see that experiment play out in the coming months and years.
Do you know what's I find really disturbing? We're living in a time where the reality is that there is a global jihadist insurgency. We know what these guys are doing. They've told us what they want to do. They've told us their tactics. 10 years ago, al-Suri, the al-Qaeda ideologue, told and called for an insurgency in Europe. ISIS, Daesh, ISIL, whatever the current word is, Islamic State is what they call themselves, have told us that they want to take us out of the grey zones. They've told us what their tactics are. Why are we taking so long to respond? Why are we, and it's not just the government, it's people, it's civil society as well. Why is there this sometimes almost political correctness around, we're not going to touch this area of debate, this issue, because we might be deemed as being bigoted. That's the real elephant in the room. People are afraid to talk about issues that affect us all. Muslim or non-Muslim, I don't care. I'm British. My children, Ankara, in Istanbul, my son and his wife were in Istanbul, in the very place where the bomb went off a week before it did. It could have been there. I want to take these issues head on. I want to tackle them. I know Douglas does, and I know most of us sitting here do. But there's still this refusal within polite society to actually get right into the heart of the debate.
So much easier to throw in a googly, talk about foreign policy, talk about Israel-Palestine, talk about anything else other than talking about what Harris has just described.
And in terms of the response to the new trend of terrorism that you describe in your piece, which is terrorist cells embedding themselves within large populations, it is frightening for lots of people, isn't it? But is there any way that governments can change to adapt to those cells being developed?
First of all, it is frightening. It's frightening for me. And it's frightening for everybody, it should be. And as Douglas said, perhaps the fright level isn't enough for people to do something.
The more troubling thing, which the Molenbeek and Belgian story in general raises, is How is it possible that this young man was able to hide in this area? A lot of people must have known he was there, at least a number.
Yeah.
And why, when the police, when the security forces in Belgium came to arrest him on Friday, were there riots from local Muslim youths at a terrorist who killed 130 people in Paris being arrested? That is the much bigger problem, and that is one that our governments are nowhere near solving, and that is what they should be addressing. The security services are dealing with the first ones. The government needs to deal with the second, and this government in Britain is nowhere near it.
That was Douglas Murray and Harris